Super, thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Alwynne. Thank you very much for having me here today. And yes, today I want to talk to you about Scots pine in Ireland and the question of whether or not it is a native Irish tree. So first of all, why figure out the native status of Scots pine? Well, Scots pine supports a wide range of native flora and fauna in Ireland. A survey that Dr. Jenny Roach did found that about 14% of native flora in Ireland live in the type of habitats that Scots pine provides. So not only is it important for us to know whether or not it's one of our native trees, it also has implications for our other native biodiversity. So that's the research justification for this piece of work. And what I want to talk to you about today is the story of Scots pine as we know it and the research to date. A bit of work that we did in Trinity with Fraser Mitchell on the work in a place called Rock Forest in County Clare, and then retell the story of Scots pine, integrating the findings of that work and what kind of changes it made to that story. So starting off with, what is the history of Scots pine here in Ireland? Well, about 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended and we moved into the time period we live in today, the Holocene. And at that point, Ireland, the ice melted and Ireland became ice-free and suitable for trees to begin to move in and live there. So Scots pine arrived about 9,500 years ago and quickly spread up through the country and reached the north coast by about 7,500 years ago. This population of Scots pine occurred naturally. It got there by natural methods, not by human introduction, and therefore is our original native Irish Scots pine. Then 4,000 years ago, something went wrong. We're not 100% sure what exactly happened, but the Scots pine in Ireland started dying out, and we had a regional Scots pine decline. Some of the theories for why this happened was it possibly some kind of climate change, maybe a pest or a disease, outcompeted by another tree species like alder, maybe the spread of blanket bog, and also the being cut down by people to make land for agriculture. Those are some of the theories, but whatever the reason, by about 1,500 years ago, we didn't have any Scots pine left here in Ireland. Then about 200 years ago, humans started bringing Scots pine in, primarily from Scotland, and planting it here. So we have a situation today where we have a lot of Scots pine in Ireland, but it is brought in by human introduction, and our original naturally occurring native Scots pine is gone. So now I want to talk to you about some work we did investigating a site in Rock Forest in County Clare. So what we really wanted to ask is, did Scots pine really go extinct? And we went to this site in Dublin, and our aim of our research project was to investigate the history of a pine population in Rock Forest. So how do you go about figuring out the history of a tree population? Well, it's through the field of palynology, which is the study of fossil pollen. So anyone with hay fever could tell you today that trees produce a lot of pollen, especially this time of year. And the main purpose of producing that pollen is to create seeds for the next generation of trees. And each taxon of tree has a different type of pollen grain. So if we look at pine pollen through the microscope, it looks like this, with kind of a Mickey Mouse kind of shape. It's got two big air bladders to help it get dispersed by the wind. So it's a very distinctive pollen grain. You always know when you've found pine because of how big it is and how obvious it is. So these pine pollen grains are actually made of very tough material, and they can be preserved for thousands of years. So just to quickly run through how our research method works, imagine a pine tree is growing, it produces pollen, and it drops the pollen on the ground around where it is growing. Then imagine a huge population of pine trees are growing. That would result in a huge amount of pine pollen being deposited in the sediment, accumulating while that population is growing. Then if there's no pine trees, there'll be no pine pollen in the sediment that accumulated during that time. So what we do is come along and take a sediment core out of the ground, and we count the pollen grains at all of the different levels to go back in time and reconstruct the history of a tree population. And when we do that, we produce what's called a pollen curve, which I'll just explain how they work because we'll be referring to them later in the talk. So on the y-axis, you have your depth of your core in centimeters. So that's how deep the core is, which is the same as going back in time. And then on the curve itself is the amount of pine pollen. So if there's more pine pollen, that's an indication of a larger pine population. And if there's less pine pollen, that's an indication that the pine population declined. So that's how it works. We went to do that in this site in County Clare. The red line outlines the population of Scots pine trees. The white line outlines a lake feature, and the black star, about a kilometre away from the forest, is an area of peat where we extracted a peat core. And this is the pollen diagram that we produced. So these are the trees and shrubs that were growing in that area. Again, on the y-axis, you have your depth. So we had a 55 centimetre core. And you can see across the top all the different taxons of trees and shrubs that we identified the pollen grains of. And then the x-axis is indicating the percentage representation of each of those trees. So the first thing we need to do before we can say anything about what this pollen diagram tells us is to convert our depths into dates. So to do that, we take radiocarbon dating. So we took 2 samples from our core and got them radiocarbon dated. And our results were 1,650 years ago and 1,120 years ago. So we knew we had a decently aged core. And now we need to extrapolate the rest of the dates for all of the other depths from those 2 radiocarbon dates. So we produced this. It's called an age depth chronology. So on your x-axis, you've got your time, and on your y-axis, you've got your depth. And the black probability distributions are our radiocarbon dates, and the grey area is the range within. There is a 95% chance that that range of depths aligns with that range of dates. So that's how we figure out how old any given depth in the core is. So now we can add a new y-axis to our pollen diagram of time going back to about 1,600 years ago. And now we can start to interpret our pine pollen curve. So this is the pine pollen curve of what we counted, and you can see it was quite highly represented because the site was so close to the pine tree population. This is what a typical pine pollen curve looks like in Ireland. If we go back to the story I told you originally, you have the large amount of pine pollen at the beginning of the core when pine was growing naturally in Ireland. And then you have this pine decline event when the pine died out. And then the pine pollen tends to come back within the last 200 years, representing the human-introduced Scots pine species. And as you can see, ours looks quite different to that traditional pine pollen curve. So the first feature that we can pick out in the pine curve that we've got is the pine decline. And the first question we wanted to ask is this pine decline in our core site the same as the regional pine decline that occurred all across Ireland? Is it the same event, or is it just a blip specific to our population? And the way we did that is we plotted a probability distribution of when that pine decline happened. So you've got your age along the x-axis here. And then we made a probability distribution for when the pine decline happened in all of the other core sites that are in the published literature in that area of Ireland. And here you can see when the pine decline hit that area of Ireland in the southwest, and you can see that our event nestles in perfectly with that timing. So we can quite confidently say that the pine decline at this stage is indeed the regional Irish pine decline. So we've got our pine decline, and we know there's supposed to be pine pollen there in the last 200 years from the reintroduction. But what's very exciting is this massive amount of pine pollen in between those 2 events. So you can see on the x-axis you have your percentages, 20, 40, 60% pine. To indicate a presence, you want it to be above 5%, and you can see we easily exceed 5% throughout the time period that there wasn't supposed to be any Scots pine in Ireland. So if we go back to our story of Scots pine in Ireland, what did these results mean? Well, we know that 7,500 years ago, we had plenty of Irish Scots pine in Ireland. And we know that 4,000 years ago, they began to decline. But our results would suggest that this population in rock forests somehow survived whatever happened to the rest of the populations. So 1,500 years ago, when there was no native Scots pine in Ireland, this population was hanging on and surviving and was still there, still present, right up until 200 years ago when the Scottish Scots pine was brought in by human introductions. So we have a scenario today where we have a lot of Scots pine growing in Ireland that is originally brought in by people from Scotland, but we do have these native Scots pine populations still occurring in our country. So the conclusion then is that the population of Scots pine is in fact a native population that persisted throughout pine decline and independent of the 18th century reintroduction. So that's quite exciting results, and I guess the obvious next question is, well, what do you do next? And is that the only population, or could there be more? And there certainly could be more. So the next steps, well, there's two avenues to take. The first is more palynology, so to find other sites that are similar to this population in rock forest, and to take another core and study the fossil pollen. So that work is ongoing with Fraser's team in Trinity. They're looking at a site in County Tipperary, and the reason this particular site was picked is because it's another site of Scots pine that's growing on a karst landscape. And the hypothesis we're playing around with at the moment is maybe the population in rock forest survived because that karst landscape was not attractive for agriculture, so that particular population did not get cut down. So if that is the reason, is there a chance that this population in County Tipperary also survived the pine decline? So the pollen has been extracted and counted for that core. The dating is quite complicated, so it's not conclusive just yet, so watch this space and we'll see what those results find in that particular core site. So that's the palynology route. And the other obvious route is genetic analysis. So is there a genetic difference between the Irish Scots pine and the reintroduced Scottish Scots pine? And can we find other refuge native Scots pine populations using genetics? So some work is ongoing in the Botanic Gardens for this, so also watch this space. One little hiccup that might come up with genetic analysis is it is possible that the Scottish Scots pine is descendant from the Irish Scots pine, so it might be hard to distinguish between the two genetically, but we won't know until those results come true. So that's the story of our work, and I'd just like to acknowledge my supervisor, Fraser, and Jenny Roach, who also contributed, and my funders. Thank you.